If you respect my dollar, you must respect my person.
Martin Luther King delivered this speech in 1967, Where do we go from here? In that speech, he tells us that we need to lean into our own institutions. Those institutions are black banks. Those institutions are black businesses.
Where do we go from here? First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth.
We desegregated our dollars, yet we never properly desegregated the methodology of getting capital into our business.
What are we doing that we could be doing differently? How do we support our own institutions? How do we support our own businesses? If you don't have a bank account at a black-owned bank, I encourage you to do that today.
Part of social justice is making sure that economic justice happens.
Now, in order to answer the question, where do we go from here, which is our theme, we must first honestly recognize where we are now.
But Dr. King, himself a victim of these same animosities, continued to inspire his people with his own.
When Martin Luther King Jr. delivered that speech in 1967, it was in an American society that had only recently begun the process of full desegregation. Black people and other people of color struggled to gain access to mainstream financial institutions. For Black people in particular, banking black wasn't really a choice. Often it was the only option. Fast forward more than 50 years later, and that same message isn't too far removed. We heard it in 2020 during protests and conversations surrounding social justice in America. Buy black, bank black. A conscious move from consumers of all colors looking to support Black economic power, especially when it came to the choice of where to keep their money. So there are consumers like Tennille Patterson who took it a step further when it came to investing her coin in a Black-owned bank like Carver. What made you want to buy stock in a company like Carver?
So I grew up in Baltimore, and there's a Black-owned bank, Carver Bank of Maryland. So I grew up knowing of this Black bank. I've known family members to bank with this Black bank. So I've already had like an ingrained respect and like wanting to like support Black banking. But Carver was New York based. So it made sense to me because it was part of my plan, like buy some stock and then later go and like open an account. I felt like at least I was doing something by having the stock and contributing to their growth that way. Banking black, buying black, that's not a new thing for me. That's not a trend.
Examining the future of the Buy Black, Bank Black movement first requires a look to the past. So let's start with this question. Why were Black banks necessary in the first place?
The idea today, notion you not be at the bank at an institution because of the color of your skin is almost hard to fathom, but it was not that long ago when this was a real issue for us.
Michael Pugh is the CEO of Carver Bank, a Black-operated bank founded in 1949 on 125th Street in Harlem. Today, the bank operates across the U.S. with the original flagship location still in place.
As you can imagine, during that time, people of color did not have access to mainstream banking solutions. They were forced to keep their money at home or in some other place that was not a traditional bank.
African-American owned banks were really sort of established in the aftermath of the Reconstruction period, and is really after the legalization of Jim Crow segregation, where you have the emergence really of these Black-owned banks. African-Americans had to set up these parallel institutions because as segregation set in, access to white financial institutions, insurance companies, banks, they didn't have that kind of access. And so by necessity, African-Americans had to set up these separate institutions.
What's your response to people that say, oh, why do we still need Black-owned or Black-operated banks in this day and age?
Need? The same way we need anything that supports a group of people. If we assimilate completely and everyone shares everything, we're still gonna fall to the bottom because we're at a detriment. We're already behind the starting line.
The evidence supports that. According to the Brookings Institute, the median white household is almost 8 times as wealthy as the median Black household in the US. And that trend has held true for the last 30 years. It's not just in net worth where there's a disparity. There are issues in lending too. According to a Zillow analysis of 2020 data from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, lenders deny mortgages for Black applicants at a rate 80% higher than that of white applicants.
Banks have always had predatory lending when it comes to Black communities. I didn't know a lot of homeowners when I was growing up, and it didn't dawn on me until I got older, like, why doesn't my family have like own homes or own property? Well, they couldn't get loans.
It's in those kinds of areas, mortgages, loans for small businesses, and community reinvestment, where Black-owned banks can make a massive difference in their own areas.
Even in the 21st century, African Americans are still facing discriminatory practices when it comes to home loans, which historically African American banks have been really sort of in a position to provide home loans for African Americans. But in terms of small businesses, some of the same issues that they've historically had to deal with, small Black business owners have had to go to these kinds of banks in order to obtain loans. So for African Americans, in terms of them wanting to engage in entrepreneurship, these African American banks have been the go-to financial institutions for that.
Thank you very much for your help.
I think the majority of the people that have chosen Carver, they select us because they are attracted to the mission in terms of the work that we do. 80 cents of every dollar that we have on deposit gets reinvested in the communities that we serve.
So we looked at the past, now let's hop into the present with this question. What does the current state of Black banking look like? Well, despite the recent surge in interest, the overall number of Black-owned and Black-operated banks is at a low. That's not necessarily new, however.
Black banks have been here before. After the Great Depression, there were only about a dozen Black-owned banks that were in operation, and it goes up to about 14 Black banks up until the 1960s, when you saw, by 1964, a resurgence in Black banking. Part of that is because of the gains of the Civil Rights Movement, and then by the late 1960s, the emergence of the Black Power movement and its emphasis on Black capitalism and Black economic empowerment really sort of led the way, and you begin to see a resurgence in Black banking.
Have you noticed an increase in the Bank Black movement or the Banking Black initiative?
Oh yeah, no question. Customers are now thinking about, okay, how do I support the ecosystem of my own community? When we talk about economic empowerment, it first has to start with our own financial choices and things that we decide in terms of how we spend our dollars and where we place our dollars. So we've seen more than $30 million of new deposit relationships come to us from large corporate partners, nonprofit organizations, and customers in our community over the past few months.
How does that compare to like past years?
So I can tell you that it's at least a 40% increase above where we've seen on our historical trends.
Did you notice a surge from even family members or friends that were saying, you know, I want to start banking Black?
I started hearing more people talk about it on social media and people asking questions, and I kind of would add my 2 cents and say, oh, well, you know, I own stock in this bank. It's about access too, right? We are okay with banking with a Bank of America because we know it's everywhere. But when you tell someone to bank with a Black bank, they're like, well, where are they? Not realizing in this day and age, you could transfer money between people and entities within seconds. You don't really need to be where your bank is.
This is where Greenwood Bank comes into play.
You ready to bet on Black for real? Then get ready for Greenwood.
The new digital banking platform was created in 2020 by founder and chairman Ryan Glover, who founded Bounce TV, and a pair of co-founders in rapper Killer Mike and former Atlanta Mayor and Congressman Andrew Young.
We wanted to target communities that banks were ignoring.
They decided that they were going to open up Greenwood Bank, and it wasn't going to be a traditional bank. In other words, it wasn't going to be a brick and mortar. They were going to form relationships with Black-owned banks and other institutions who have FDIC protections, and it's completely online. So again, and accessible supposedly across the country. The naming of this bank has some inspiration from the ideal of the Black Wall Street. Greenwood, for those who don't know, was the historic Black district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as the Black Wall Street.
The mobile platform hasn't even launched yet, but good luck getting that golden ticket. With over 500,000 signups so far, Greenwood has a lengthy waiting list in the 6 digits. When I reached out to folks on the list, one woman on Twitter told me why she decided to sign up, saying that, quote, "I signed up honestly because it's Black owned. As a Black woman, I'm realizing the Black dollar doesn't stay in our own community. Other communities have a way of keeping money rotating amongst themselves, and we don't. We spend money with big chain companies, and if we have the same resources, why not give my money to someone that looks like me?" So when it comes to the Black dollar, that brings us to the other part of that Martin Luther King Jr. question. Where do we go from here? If Greenwood is the future, what does that mean for other Black owned and operated banks going forward?
They're going to have to be more creative. Whether we're talking about things like Cash App or something like that, they're going to have to think about ways to reach these depositors who, even if they can, they're still not going to bank with a traditional institution and who are simply not going to run a bank. Like, I rarely go into a bank. I don't go to the ATM. Everything happens digitally. So why would we expect a younger crowd to go into a physical banking location when they just don't have to? Nevertheless, they want to bank. They want to support these Black-owned institutions. They just have to figure out a way to make sure that it's accessible for them to do so.
Supporting Black banking, I just know it's the backbone of our country. My people just deserve better. We can teach ourselves how to be better with money each day, but when we start valuing what it can do for us and the opportunities it creates for ourselves, our future, like our community, we'll be way better off.